Almost 2 months ago, we released our first game, Forge Industry. And it's been a ride so far, but I think it's finally time for us to move on to a next game. What do I mean by this? Well, for probably the first month really after we launched Forge Industry, we still kept working on it pretty much daily. We kept updating bugs, we added some new features, we redid some UI elements, and we listened to the feedback of the community, and we also just interacted with the community. Now, however, we feel like we've done most of the things we feel like we had to do in order to give the best support for our community, and we want to move on to next things. This is always a very hard decision. Basically, when do you move on from a game? It's almost like a breakup. You've been together with this game for, like, in our case, more than 1.5 years, and suddenly it's not there anymore. Or well, it is, but it just feels different. You're not spending as much time with each other anymore, and you feel like, you need to move on. I don't know how relatable this is because we're all game developers in the end, but this basically bears the question, when do you break up with your game? When do you move on, and when do you start with a newer, younger, hotter, strapping game idea? And how do you do the transition as good as possible without hurting anyone's feelings? In this case, mostly your community that has already bought the game. You don't just want to dump a broken game on them. So I want to talk a bit more about how did we go through this? How did we evaluate what are we still gonna do? What are we not gonna do? And how did we end up with this decision of, okay, what are we still gonna do? And when are we moving on? And I think I want to start with first being like, don't pump and dump as a game developer. Don't just make a game, put it on Steam, and start making the next game. This is like the quickest way to get your reputation as a game developer destroyed. Instead, always set aside time, probably 2 to 4 weeks after you release a game, to take care of feedback, to answer community questions, and also just implement like some last minute additions as well. Why you should do this is also because this first 2 to 4 weeks in the long run of your game will probably still have the most sales, unless you have like some Chinese community picks up on your game or something half a year down the line. Generally, most of your sales will happen in the first month, and especially in the first 3 months. And after that, it'll calm down and it'll be like a trickle here and there, but nothing the size of like an original launch, assuming you had like some following. And by being active when you're in that period, when the most people are visiting your Steam page, when most people are looking at the reviews, by being active as a developer and like also being on like the Steam discussions, you show that, hey, this game, there's still love and attention into it, and I'm not just getting like an asset flip kind of game that the developer is just gonna yeet off the moment that the game has released, and I'm actually gonna get value for my money. Now, there is a big struggle here, and this is like a trap a lot of people fall into, and that is post-release support versus basically making a 2.0 update of your game. You need to be very clear here. What I'm talking about and what we did is really simple stuff. Quick wins, I would call them as well. That is stuff like, well, for example, we had bugs, like our milestone system was broken. Well, obviously we had to fix it. Or we had some UI elements that weren't really up to polish, or that we got some feedback of that, hey, this doesn't really make sense. So we reworked those, or we like increased some UX by like adding an extra button that like skips a step and like reduces the amount of clicks you need to do to reach like a certain task. These are fine. And we even added like a little bit of extra code stuff to like add some visual flair to our game. And we did also add a few features, I would say, but those were really limited, and they were only because we really needed them. There was a very vocal outcry from both us, honestly, and from the people who played the game that were like, well, we don't know how the tutorial works. So we completely rewrote the tutorial system. We added like, buildings now flash that you need to click on them, or like buttons will really hold your hand now. This required extra code to be written. Or for example, our game wasn't really dynamic enough. We also wrote some code for that, but we didn't add any new mechanics. And this is important. Don't add mechanics. This is not the scope. There are some cases in which you can do it, but I'll get into those in a second. Generally, don't deal with those things. If you're gonna listen to everything the community has to say, well, you're gonna be working on the game for another like 10 years, because we've gotten feedback from people who are like, hey, this game is great. How about you add like a happiness factor for your like little workers, and you need to feed them, and there's like an extra currency system and like supply lines. And at that point, we're not making an automation game anymore. We're making a city builder, and that's never been the scope we set out for. So that's also not something we will ever implement. Sorry if you're the viewer who really wanted to have like our game as more of a city builder. We're not gonna be doing that, unfortunately. Maybe in Forge Industry 2, but I'm currently not thinking about that one yet. Now, when should you keep supporting for maybe longer than like 2 to 4 weeks? This comes down to a few things. first of all, how active is your community? If you have like daily discussions and people are very active, you'll be more motivated to work on the game to begin with, because you're not just doing stuff and throwing it into the void. You're actually getting feedback from the players, whether that's good or bad. And even the bad one does really feel good because it's still people playing your game. These things help a lot. Or maybe you just want to add features from your own as well. You're like, hey, we had these things that we just had to launch really, but I still want to spend some more time into it. This is almost as if you're like doing an unofficial early access where you've made a base game and then you keep making like some pretty big content updates, even though there was no upfront promise that they would be happening. And then the biggest reason, honestly, both previous ones are fine, but they're not realistic. If you don't make enough money to sustain yourself, to sustain your development, it doesn't make sense to keep working on the same game. This one is a bit complicated though, because you have people who are like, hey, but if you do put more effort into the game and people like your game more, you'll get like more reviews and they'll tell their friends or whatever, and you'll get more sales that way. But I think this is really risky. And generally I don't recommend it because, as I said, for 99% of the games, all of your sales will happen in the first 2 to 4 weeks. Not that many games have those enormous booms after they've already launched and been like active for like half a year or something, where there's suddenly a new influx of players because you've kept updating the game. Generally, you're gonna wanna move on. Because I've also talked to developers who really wanted to keep working on their game, but someone at some point will need to pay rent, and someone at some point will need to be able to like send their kid to school or whatever. And just like sustaining for like 3 people who still play your game, adding new content isn't worth it. It sucks. Maybe you want to give them a good experience, but there's only so much you can do if you're not really making any money. You're much better off than like making a new game, learning from your old game, and making sure that your next game is gonna be much more successful. Start gathering those wish lists. Make sure that you have a much better launch, more initial launch volume, things like that. Look at external funding, whatever. You can't really, there's like a few, you can't really get a publisher anymore to fund your game once it's already been released, or even when it's like close to release. By getting them early engaged, you can get much more money, much more funding, and sustain being a game developer for just longer in general. Now, when do you move on? This is a bit similar to what I just said, but basically, if you don't like the game, if you don't want to work on it anymore, you've just shipped it because you wanted to be done with it, even though the players may love it, and you can like sometimes force yourself if there's like a lot of sales, but at some point you're gonna be like, no, this has been it, I quit. Or if the game is simply dead and there's like 1 person online daily active user, well, then it also doesn't make sense because you're just throwing code into the void basically. Or as I said, you just can't afford keeping developing and not starting on something new. Now, how do you deal with this? In my opinion, somewhat gracefully. You slowly fade it out. With breakups, it's often like, we shouldn't see each other anymore. It's a bit different here. The first 2 weeks we did basically full-time Forge Industry still, and then we reduced it to about 2 to 3 days a week of Forge Industry, as also the reports of like bugs and stuff dimmed down a bit. And then I think up until like last week it was like 1 to 2 days if it was like special, like for example reworking our tutorial took some time, but generally not that much time anymore. And I think now we're fading out to maybe a few hours a week at most, and probably some weeks with no work anymore. There's still a few things that I want to do, but they're like very casual, like adding some more models to like add some dynamicism, but that's it. Nothing special anymore, and we don't really have much features roadmapped anymore. Also, if bugs do come up still, we like let them wait for like a week, collect a few of them, and then push out an update where we fix some of the bugs as well. These are the quick wins, we can still do that. This way I feel like you end on good terms, and it's more natural. It eases you out because also you're gonna fall into a hole if you've been developing like non-stop on a game for like 2 years and then suddenly you're not working on it anymore. What are you gonna do? There's suddenly no more structure. You have to start a brand new project that you don't really know anything about. You need to ease into your next project as well. And by easing out of the old one, you can do a pretty smooth transition to whatever next game it is that you're working on. Also, keep your followers in the loop. Don't just disappear, but maybe make like a community post with like your last big update that's like, hey, these are all the features we've added. This is gonna be the last one that we're doing. We'll do some bug fixing, but that's it. If you wanna stay followed, like join our Discord server or subscribe to us on YouTube, where we'll post like updates on our next game. Try to get some momentum along as well, because this will also help you with marketing your next game. Sure, not everyone who plays Forge Industry will be interested in our next game, but it will be something, and it will be that initial wishlist boost that can help us a lot as well already. And then lastly, know that you can never make everyone happy. There's always gonna be some people who are like, oh my God, how dare you? I paid 16 euros for this. I deserve support until the end of time. And that's an opinion they have, and that's perfectly fine to have, but realistically, you can't sustain them, and there's always gonna be some people like that. There's plenty of people out there as well who are very understanding of what's going on and who don't mind that the game doesn't get like frequent, like big updates anymore. The game has been released after all, and everything else may just be a bonus in their eyes. I hope that explains a bit more of our reasoning, as well as helps you as well with what you do once your game has been released. I'm curious, how do you handle these things? What's your view on that? Leave us a comment down below. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts because it teaches me a lot as well. If I have some big L takes, you guys always school me and I like that, so keep doing it. Apart from that, if you're new here, we're a game development studio. We've made our own game, we're making more games, and we're also making content aimed at game developers. So that could be either like more design topic stuff, or we make videos about our own games, such as this one a bit, or when we go to events, we usually bring you guys along, we make a little vlog, things like that. So if that's something that you're interested in, you can go down below the video, give us a like, and also maybe subscribe, as it really helps us out and you get this cool content twice a week. So it's a win-win for both of us. That's all I really have to say. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!